in terms of who was targeted for restrictive for their speech being restricted, I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more on those 1,000 plus arrests of people, because I mean some targeted were, you know, explicitly say socialists calling for an anti-war movement, but also like just more broadly the determination of which groups were subversive was expanded with this power. What were some of those groups?
Yeah, that's a good question, Emma. I think we would find that probably a majority of those 1,000 people, and I should also add that about half of them, I'm just talking about people sent to prison for a year or more, about half of them were convicted under the Espionage Act, and about half of them were convicted under copycat state laws that were sometimes written with the help of the federal Justice Department that duplicated the Espionage Act and in some cases went further. The Espionage Act, incidentally, had almost nothing to do with actual espionage. Only 10 of those cases were people actually accused of being German spies. I bet of those 1,000 people, a majority were either Socialist Party activists or militant labor activists, because, and these were both groups that the government wanted to suppress. The Socialist Party had won 6% of the vote for president in the popular vote for president in the 1912 presidential election. And by 1917, Wilson was very afraid of them because the socialists made big gains in municipal elections that fall. And he knew that if the following year, 1918, they did similarly well in the midterm elections, there could be half a dozen or a dozen socialist members of the House of Representatives, which Wilson's Democrats held only by a very tiny, tiny majority. And the last thing he wanted was to have an anti-war party have the balance of power in the House. So he went about imprisoning socialists, enough of them before long so that had they all been in the same prison, they could have had a good-sized party Congress behind bars. The most famous of them, of course, was Eugene Debs, the party's 5-time candidate for president, a very saintly, gentle man who was much respected even by people who didn't like his politics, who was deeply committed to nonviolence, deeply committed to the electoral process, and sent to prison for 10 years because of an anti-war speech he gave in a park in Canton, Ohio. And he was immediately brought to trial under the Espionage Act, found himself facing a judge who was the former law partner of Wilson's Secretary of War, sentenced to prison for 10 years. He was still in prison, like many war critics, in November of 1920, more than 2 years after the war ended, when inside the Atlanta penitentiary, he received 900,000 votes for president. Finally, after this whole period of repression eased the following year, Warren Harding, who'd become president, let him out of prison after he'd served 2.5 years and actually invited him to stop in Washington for a visit on his way home. And when Wilson left Harding's office after that visit, he told reporters, "I've run for the White House 5 times, but this is the first time I've actually gotten here."
Just getting back to the number of socialists who were in Congress at that time, was that the last time that we saw that many unaffiliated, or I should say non-Democrat or non-Republican affiliated elected officials in the House?
Well, actually, when I said the socialists might have had half a dozen or a dozen people in the House in 1918, I meant if the party hadn't been suppressed. There was never more than one actual socialist member of the House of Representatives in this period. One guy from Wisconsin, later on one guy from New York, then the guy from Wisconsin came back, never more than one at a time, although there were more than 1,000 socialists elected to state and municipal offices around the country in this era.
There was something like 23 socialist mayors, I guess, at that time.
Yes. Yeah, there were socialist mayors of immensely varied cities, Milwaukee, Pasadena, Schenectady. There were at one point 10 socialists in the lower house of the New York State legislature, many socialists on city councils and that kind of thing, where they had a reputation for being noticeably less corrupt than the other parties. And actually, the socialists who ran Milwaukee for many years not only built parks and libraries and so on, actually raised the city's credit rating.
How devastating was that era to the Socialist Party? I mean, coming out, could you see a measurable difference after all these arrests, that level of intimidation? Eugene Debs is in prison for, a number of years. Like you say, Harding lets him out earlier. But how devastating was it to building both in terms of building the infrastructure of the Socialist Party, but also in terms of changing the mindset of the American public towards socialists at that time?
I think it was immensely damaging to the party. I think if something like this hadn't happened, the party would never have been a majority party in the United States, because socialism in America never had the appeal that it did in Western Europe for a lot of reasons. I think having to do with so many immigrants coming here hoping to raise their status class-wise rather than sort of unite as a working class against the capitalist class. Never would have been a majority movement, but had it been not so ruthlessly crushed in this period, I think it might have been a more influential minority movement, as it was in Canada, for example. And it might have pushed the mainstream parties more in the direction of having the kind of really good social safety net and fully comprehensive national healthcare systems that they have throughout Western Europe and just across the border in Canada. The other thing I think that was seriously damaged in this period was the labor movement. The government deliberately crushed the most militant labor union, the Wobblies, as they were known, the industrial workers of the world, threw hundreds of its leaders in jail. That organization was crushed. And even the American Federation of Labor, which was very mainstream, had not opposed the war, lost 1 million members during this era of repression.
How much did racism also inhibit, or how much did racism make the socialist movement and the labor movement, for that matter, more susceptible or weaker in light of what was happening? I mean, people forget too. This is right around the time where we have the peak membership of the KKK in this country. And 6%, I think I've seen out of we're talking 6 million people out of 100 million at that time. How much did racism prevent the broad working class from developing a solidarity?
I think it had a huge impact because many unions wouldn't allow Black members. The IWW, the Wobblies, were a sterling exception, and I think it's one of the things that made them appeal not just to its members, but to the middle class as well. They said everyone is welcome, native-born and immigrant, Black and white, male and female. Several notable Wobbly organizers were women, actually. That was another reason the government wanted to crush them. The fact that labor unions, many mainstream labor unions, excluded Black members, handed industry a tactic which they used ruthlessly in this period, which was when there was a strike, they would hire Black strikebreakers to break it. The Blacks were fleeing the South, desperate for jobs, willing to work for less money than more established white working class people. And it's always useful, if you're trying to break a strike, make use of existing racial antagonisms. And employers did this ruthlessly, using Black strikebreakers and also trying to stir up animosity between different ethnic groups, because some of the immigrant groups didn't get along with each other very well. The Serbs and the Italians, for example, in Chicago.